There is inequality in the world. A statement of the bleeding obvious. It's suggested by some that such inequality gets created by capitalism, which creates wealth for some by exploiting others, and that it's exacerbated by such things as systemic racism that keeps people down who don't fit the profile. You can't change the world if you don't see it clearly. So let's start by looking at the question, why is there inequality in the world, and what, if anything, should be done about it? If you look at the progress of the human race, one of the things you'll note is that things were unequal long before the term capitalism was ever framed. And there were a number of factors that led to this. There was geography and climate, there were cultural factors, and there were social factors. There were more than we can cover in one video for sure, but let's just take a look at some of the most important. From the earliest times of humans, where you were located was a big factor in how well you're going to do. Places with highly fertile soil were obviously a massive boon to people. Those were found almost exclusively in temperate zones, almost non-existent in the tropics or the Arctic. The amount of rainfall a place receives, the ability of the soil to hold the water, not great in the limestone soils of the Balkans, for instance, much better in northern China. Some places were just too wet. Swamps that became productive only when human technology got to the point where those swamps could be drained. Where you couldn't have effective agriculture, you couldn't produce the sort of surpluses that allowed for cities to build up. And cities were the fast breeders for success for human beings. So that was a factor in the earliest times, but geography has been important ever since. Countries that had long navigable rivers were able to move goods around long before the railways and then the roads were created. In 1830, it cost more than $30 to move a ton of cargo 300 miles on land, but only $10 to send it 10 times that distance across water. So ports thrived and places that could be accessed via internal riverways likewise. London, Amsterdam, Venice, these became centres of commerce and powerhouses of development. The great inland cities, such as Paris, could become so only because they were served by major rivers. And this was to Europe's benefit, with its intricate coastline creating many harbours and islands and peninsulas. It was to Africa's disbenefit. Although the continent of Africa is twice as large as that as Europe, it has less coastline, because it's smooth and its coastal waters are often too shallow for big ships to dock. China, Europe, North America all had long navigable rivers, many fed by melting mountain glaciers, so they continued to flow even when the summer dry weather was the norm. Tropical Africa, which is more than 1,000 to 2,000 feet above sea level, has rivers instead that have many waterfalls. Not only that, but rivers that in the dry season run too shallow for boats or even dry up completely. Then there's the nature of the land itself. Lands that spread from the east to the west, such as Eurasia, shared the same latitude, so broadly similar climatic conditions. And that meant that farming knowledge and technology could be freely spread because what works in one place would work in another. And so you got things like spaghetti, originating in China and becoming a staple food in Italy. Lands that spread from the north to the south could find that such spread was a lot harder. The people of South America had a similar climate to that of those in the north, but being separated as they were by the tropics, which had very different conditions, knowledge and technology spread was much more limited. So, for example, the potato didn't reach North America from the south for a much longer period of time. Those climatic conditions weren't even always stable. The prompt for the downfall of some of the great Chinese dynasties was often the onset of periods of poor climate, the 9 sloughs, bringing hardship and famine and often with it rebellion. The inequality of soil fertility is still a factor in the present day. Even with the advance of technology, crop yields in Africa are a fraction of those from temperate regions. But if you look at the world today, wealth and poverty is not restricted to places based on their access to natural resources. So clearly there were other factors that have been in play as well. Here's a topical one: diseases. At a time when people had no concept of microorganisms, they, and the sweep of history, were nevertheless hugely influenced by them. In the early stages, the growing connections between people in Europe and Asia saw the spread of terrible epidemics such as bubonic plague of the 14th century. But the survivors in Europe developed biological resistance to a wider range of diseases as a result. And when Europeans and some indigenous races came into contact, the latter were decimated by disease, while the Europeans were much less affected by the local ones there. According to the historian Francis Jennings, one kindly Spanish missionary who went to the native people of South America was probably responsible for more deaths than any conquistador. The same wasn't true in Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, the tropical diseases were deadly to outsiders, particularly Europeans, with no exposure to the tropics. It was said that the life expectancy of a white man in tropical Africa was less than a year, which is why European empires only spread to sub-Saharan Africa relatively late, once medical science had reached a certain point. For the people of sub-Saharan Africa, diseases often contributed to their isolation from each other because of the impact of diseases carried by the tsetse fly on animals that might otherwise have become beasts of burden or prime movers in agriculture. So those diseases substantially prevented the advances for them that were taking place elsewhere. Once the world was made up of great powers grabbing chunks of territory for their empires, where you were located again made a huge difference. So islands like Sicily and Malta were directly in the line of fire between nations that had been fighting each other for centuries. So they were conquered and then they were reconquered, and every time what was left was physical destruction as well as significant cultural impact. Britain, of course, was an island nation. It was bigger and harder to conquer. It was importantly separated by the rough waters of the English Channel. It was invaded by the Romans and then by the Normans, but then it was able to become an advanced nation, and the existence of the English Channel meant that it didn't need to maintain the sort of large standing army necessary for nations like the French and the Germans and the Russians, which may be one factor in its stability and why it ended up in the front charge of the Industrial Revolution. Sometimes the benefit of location came down to more local political factors. In colonial Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, British missionaries set up schools in the areas they most favoured and left the Americans to do likewise in the less favoured northern tip, where the Tamil minority were based. Well, it turned out the American schools focused more on science and mathematics than the British ones. I don't know what they taught. Cricket, maybe? Anyway, as a result, Tamils started to do better in occupations that needed practical training. Likewise in Nigeria, the Igbos lived in the poorest areas and had once been slaves, but they embraced the opportunities presented to them in education in Western missionary schools that were opened in their region. By contrast, the Muslim peoples of the north rejected schools associated with Christian missionaries, and so by default, the Igbos began to fill professional and business occupations much more than those from the north. That last one takes us from purely geographical factors to cultural ones. In that instance, you had one group that embraced an opportunity, another that, for whatever good or bad reason, rejected it. Such cultural factors can define entire nations or groups within nations, right down to the level of the family and the individuals. On the national level, you might start by asking the question, why are some of the former imperial powers still wealthy today, but others not? If you hold a view that the former colonialist powers got the wealth they have today by exploiting their former colonies, then you'd have to explain Spain. In the Golden Age, it was the head of an empire. They plundered the gold of their conquests, used it to buy all of the luxuries that any elite could ask for. Today, Spain is one of the poorest countries in Europe. How come? The historian Arnold Toynbee, writing in 1915, said this: the Spaniards had acquired their national unity and built a huge empire by being soldiers and crusaders, not by being merchants and craftsmen. Indeed, not only did they not have the tradition of such activities, they actively disdained commerce, industry and skilled labour, seeing them as being beneath them. And that was an economic handicap that hit the country once its ability to plunder gold from others passed into history. And it passed that culture onto the Latin American countries that it ruled over. One of the key indicators of a productive culture is its attitude to timekeeping. Nations that had to overcome challenges developed an awareness of time, which is why some, such as Germans, Japanese, to a lesser extent the UK and the US, have a culture of being on time. Whereas in Latin America, it's a tradition that is not even remotely a factor. So cultures can make a difference. As people have historically moved around the world, they often take their cultures with them, to the benefit of some, the disbenefit of others. Germans, for instance, have historically been one group that took their culture with them and have been consistently successful wherever they decided to settle. The same has been the case with Chinese immigrants in a number of places, the Lebanese in West Africa, Australia and America, Jews in Europe, the Middle East, America and Australia, and of course the various peoples of India in various other countries. Once the migrants from these groups arrived, usually with nothing except for the willingness to work hard and ambition to get ahead, and of course a culture that valued education. They often had to survive in countries that actively denied them equal rights, put obstacles in their way at every turn. You only have to look at how the Chinese were treated in America in the 19th century, the era of the so-called Yellow Peril. All these groups did whatever work they could. Former doctors would be washing dishes or whatever it took. They worked extremely hard and saved every cent to every penny, so that as soon as they could financially afford it, they could get their children into higher education, pushing them into new possibilities and on to better things. As a strategy, it worked over and over again. Wasn't easy, it was a tough life, but it worked. With all the prejudices that there sometimes were, with all the obstacles placed in front of them. As a cultural norm, those behaviours were a pretty solid predictor of success. So inequality can't simply be a function of the environment that people find themselves in and the obstacles they're confronted with. Otherwise, no disadvantaged groups would ever be able to transcend their starting points. And the thing is that such groups that have come in, bringing that determination to succeed, in so doing they help to raise the success of the society that they join. For instance, it wasn't until Italians and Germans arrived in Argentina that it began to exploit its extremely fertile land. It had always been capable of growing wheat on that land, but only when people arrived who were prepared to do everything that was required did it become productive. So it's not just about location and climate that shows when a country becomes successful. And this became obvious with Argentina. In 1914, foreigners made up 30% of the Argentine population, but owned 72% of the businesses, 82% of those in Buenos Aires. It was something that the Argentine government itself recognised. It tried to attract people from European cultures seen as being the most thrifty and the hardest workers. That doesn't always happen. When you get outgroups that become more successful than the norm, very often what actually happens is that results in resentments by the lagging population. The Japanese were resented in Peru, for instance. There were attempted boycotts of Japanese-owned businesses, which were usually unsuccessful because the Japanese charged lower prices than the others. It ended in Japanese immigration being seriously restricted in the 1930s. And the same for Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, Igbos in Nigeria, Tamils in Sri Lanka, Indians in East Africa, Jews in Eastern Europe, Lebanese in West Africa, and so on and so on. Countries where the resentments take over and they expel those hard-working, wealth-creating groups who they decide are exploiters or parasites, the nations that drove out those groups often ended up worse off once they'd gone. Spain, for instance, drove out the Moriscos and found only after it had divested itself of those people that they were the only people who could maintain its intricate irrigation system for its agriculture. Of course, cultures are not fixed. And as people move about the world, different races and nations borrow cultural aspects from each other all of the time. It's been a key part of societies finding ways to improve their lot, learning about what worked for anyone else and copying it. Western civilization replaced its use of Roman numerals with Arabic numbers because they were practically better for mathematics. All the cultural advances over centuries have been spread by influence across the world in the same way. Money, roads, weapons, printing presses, vaccinations, transport. Often groups learning from the people that conquered them, which doesn't form a moral justification for colonialism, obviously. But then again, not all groups have been equally hungry to learn and absorb cultural advances from other people. Japan cut itself off from the outside world for over 2 centuries. Up until that point, Japan was technologically ahead of many in the West, but during that period it drastically fell behind. The Islamic world was likewise way more advanced than its rivals during the Middle Ages. Europe learned a lot from it, about mathematics and philosophy and agriculture and much more besides. The Ottoman Empire was one of the greatest empires in history. In 2014, The Economist magazine said this: 1,000 years ago, the great cities of Baghdad, Damascus and Cairo took turns to race ahead of the Western world. Islam and innovation were twins. The various Arab caliphates were dynamic superpowers, beacons of learning, tolerance and trade. Yet today, the Arabs are in a wretched state. The most important lesson there is that a culture that is highly attuned to success can degrade over time. All of this made the dynamic behind this debate stark. Representatives of the majority lagging groups would often promote a sense of grievance in their populations, demanding a fair share of jobs and wealth. It was then, and remains so today, an assumption that the question of how wealth is distributed is somehow a separate question to how wealth is produced in the first place. Historically, the hostility of large lagging groups to more productive minorities was a remarkably poor way to solve the problems of poverty. Other cultural aspects that influence how well societies and groups succeed include other basic elements such as trust. High trust societies tend to do well economically, but it's been known for a long time that societies high on corruption and crime have an immense drag on success. Norway and Nigeria, for instance, are both oil-rich countries. In Norway's case, it's been a blessing economically, not so much in Nigeria's case. In 2015, The Economist magazine said this: "The chief cause is Nigeria's inability to process its crude. Corruption and mismanagement have left its 4 state refineries to rot, forcing this fuel-guzzling country to import up to 80% of its needs." Obviously, corruption has a cost in terms of bribes paid, but that has a multiplier in terms of opportunity cost. All the businesses that don't get started, the investments not made, the jobs not created, because the risk of business makes it less worthwhile to do those things. Some major firms, such as IKEA, concluded at one point that it was impossible to do business in Russia without paying bribes, so they wouldn't operate there. Russia matches an abundance of natural resource with a low standard of living for its people. High corruption there preceded and sadly survived communism. So, those are some of the cultural aspects. We've talked about valuing education and hard work, not feeling that certain work is beneath you. We've talked about honesty and trust. These are elements of what you could call human capital. There are other social aspects, such as how children are raised. A study in 2015 found that American children in families where the parents are in professional occupations hear an average of 2,100 words per hour. Children of working class parents hear only an average of 1,200 words an hour, and children whose family is on welfare hear around 600 words an hour. That makes a lasting difference to the child. And there are differences by race as well as by class. The same study suggested that white American parents play with, talk to and listen to their children 3 times as often as black American parents. In England, though, similar phenomena have been observed in some of the poor working class white communities. So the cultural issues are not defined necessarily by race per se. It's wherever certain cultural norms take root. Thomas Sewell observed this: "The fact that life is unfair is not the same as saying that a particular institution or a particular society is unfair. We cannot tell where the unfairness occurred by where the statistics were collected. In other words, if a business has an underrepresentation of a certain group, is that a sign of discrimination by that business or an unfairness much earlier in the chain? And this strikes to the heart of the issue, because the American dream is that everyone can improve their lot and be better off than their parents. But how much people do that comes down to the qualities of the individuals, their skills, their intelligence, their work ethic. It doesn't just happen. If certain groups that start off poor consistently move up and other groups consistently fail to do the same, it's not enough to say that, well, it must be the overall system that makes them poor, or that they're poor because rich people are rich. You have to start looking at the facts of what are the behaviours on the one group that predict success that's missing in the failing group. And you can change and adapt to embrace those behaviours, or you can decide not to, but those actions are what have consequences. You now have people talking about the evils of cultural appropriation. At the extreme, you have people being told that rationality and hard work are symbols of white supremacy and therefore to be avoided. Those things call Spain to mind, celebrating a culture that militates against your own future success. And you can see it today in America, as Thomas Sowell again notes. Black youngsters seeking to speak the standard English of a larger society, often as part of a more general absorption of educational and other components of a larger culture, have been accused of acting white, a charge that can bring anything from ridicule to ostracism to harassment or outright violence from fellow blacks. And this matters because if you diagnose the problem wrong, then your solutions are probably going to be wrong as well. Very rarely do the campaigners and the politicians ever step back and evaluate whether their advocacy actually benefits the people they claim to represent. So, for instance, the performance of blacks in higher education, in spite of all the positive discrimination policies, has declined, not advanced. In the 1980s, affirmative action policy in the US resulted in rising numbers of black students admitted to the University of California at Berkeley. But the number who graduated actually declined. If you're interested in outcomes, you should be concerned about that, shouldn't you? When the policy was abolished in the following decade, the number of black students overall declined, but the number graduating actually increased. If it's gotten worse over the last half century, you can't say it's a legacy of slavery or systemic racism. In 1938, the percentage of blacks attending the prestigious Stuyvesant High School was almost as high as the percentage of blacks in the population of New York City. By 1979, it had dropped to 12.9%. By 1995, it was 4.8%. By 2012, it was 1.2%. Where does all this leave us? You should be aware we've only just scratched the surface, but differences in income and wealth, whether between nations or within nations, obviously come from a range of causes. The people who talk about inequality being the most egregious issue in the modern world seem to bring a misconception to the discussion which is not backed up by fact, which is the idea that equality is the natural state of humanity, upset and interrupted only by some injustice inflicted upon the people by a malign force. In truth, poverty has been the norm historically. The dynamic process of escaping it should be where we're directing most of our attention. They claim that focusing on inequality is about removing poverty. In truth, it tends to focus rather a lot on what's happening at the other end. Over the last century, the spread of capitalism has seen the proportion of people worldwide living in absolute poverty drop, halved in real terms, even as the world population doubled. The question is whether you focus on the quality of life of the people at the bottom, which has been generally improving, or whether you focus on the gap between the top and the bottom. For some who are taken up with the resentment side of it, it's not enough to lift the poor out of poverty. The priority is that those at the top must also be brought down. But this then is a problem that never gets solved. Most people living at the poverty line in America today have already got more in the way of air conditioning, microwave ovens, cable television, smartphones and a motor vehicle than the wealthiest people in the 1970s had. The very real social problems of poverty in the US are not the same problems of real and desperate material deprivation that defined poverty a century ago. The problem is that there's now a culture that's well embedded within some groups that is hostile to the factors that would equip them or their children with the human capital to escape poverty. The reason why capitalism has been successful in history where communism hasn't is because it focuses on the creation of wealth, not just its distribution. Likewise, people talk about the gap between the rich and the poor widening as though these were static groups of people. Capitalism must be bad because the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. But if you look at the individuals who are members of those two groups, they move up and down, in and out of those groups constantly. A study by the University of Michigan showed that working Americans who were in the bottom 20% had their real incomes rise at a significantly higher rate than those who were initially in the top 20%. 95% of those who were initially in the bottom quintile in 1975 were no longer there by 1991. 29% of them made it all the way into the top quintile. People move up, people drop down. These are not static groups. The bottom quintile of working Americans is usually made up of younger people starting on their careers. As they move up, the next generation take their place. Now, this is, of course, working Americans. People whose culture has led them to live happily or contentedly or even grudgingly on welfare benefits, to avoid the career ladder altogether. Unsurprisingly, they do not take part in that journey. Likewise, the top group, even the fabled 1%, is constantly moving. Now, bear in mind, most of the comparisons don't distinguish between salary income and investment income. If I built my business for 30 years and then sold it for $100,000, well, woohoo, that year I make it into the top 20%. And straight back out again the following year, because it was the realization of a long-term investment, not a regular income. People don't pay much attention to those sorts of factors. Does any of this mean that capitalism is perfect and has no negative outcomes? Of course not. What it should suggest is that we need a more sophisticated view of the inevitable reality of inequality. It should suggest that we become interested in whether our culture is encouraging and feeding success or breeding self-destructive behaviours and then justifying them as we slip deeper and deeper into resentment.